There's been a lot of talk lately about fake news and false information. Well, one place you can go to make sure you get real information and learn real history and economics is Liberty Classroom. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn more. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Ted Snider about his article, The End of Obama's Term, a report card on Latin America. Mr. Snider writes about patterns in U.S. foreign policy and history. You can follow his work via his archives at antiwar.com and at consortiumnews.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Obama-Latin-America. Ted, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining me. So the title does a pretty good job of explaining what's covered in the article, but nonetheless, I'm assuming that most of my audience has not read the article. Hopefully they will after hearing this interview, but I'm assuming they haven't yet. So let's just start out with a brief overview of your article and what you cover in there.
Okay, so the reason I wrote this towards the end of Obama's term is that in 2008, when Obama first got elected to the first term, one of his major foreign policy promises was that he intended to do, as he said, he intended to do business differently with Latin America. That he would make that promise is a significant promise because the history of America's business in Latin America has been an ugly history of coups and interference. And so I thought it would be interesting at the end of the 8 years to look at whether he had made good on that promise to do business differently in South America and Central America, or whether he had continued the pattern of his predecessors. So what I'm looking at is a sort of review and an evaluation of that promise in Latin America.
Sure. So let's look at the policies of his predecessors before we get into Obama's record and evaluate his performance. So before we get into any specific events that took place during his predecessor's times in office, let's just discuss sort of general patterns pre-Obama and what U.S. policy and policy goals in Latin America looked like before Obama was inaugurated.
Okay, I think the largest general pattern, I think, when you look at America's behavior and what it considers to be its backyard, is the idea of natural resources either being used by the people in that country or America wanting to use those natural resources for themselves. And I think the sort of enemy in American foreign policy has the idea of a foreign leader who is a democratic nationalist. And what I mean by enemy and by democratic nationalist is that if you let the people vote for a leader, democratic, they're going to vote for somebody who's going to share the nation's wealth with the people of the nation instead of exporting it abroad. So if you get a democratic leader, people are going to vote for someone who's going to keep the national resources at home. And if you get a nationalist leader, it's somebody who's willing to do that. The enemy of American foreign policy has been a leader who gets elected by his people and then chooses to use the wealth generated by the natural resources for the people who voted for them. America prefers to use those resources for herself, and so there's a long history of America, despite being this sort of beacon and exporter of democracy, taking out democratic governments in Latin America and installing dictators who will instead let America use their natural resources. So starting incredibly early in American history, you see this pattern of removing people who wanted to nationalize their resources and installing dictators who are willing to let America use their natural resources. So I think that's the largest policy. The smaller part of that is the idea of the spread of contagion, the idea that you don't want to let one country do that because it'll spread and lots of countries will do that. And then you get this idea, Kissinger talked about the idea that if you can't stop the spread of the contagion in your own backyard, how are you possibly going to do it anywhere else? So Latin America became especially important as a place of making the example that you can't have a democratic nationalist, you can't have a country use their own resources because of the idea that the fear in America that if you can't control that right in your own backyard, you can't control the world. Latin America became the most important place to make sure you had leaders that were willing to share the wealth of their natural resources with America. So Latin America is a pivotal place for examining this idea in American foreign policy, which is what I found it, so interesting that Obama recognized that and said, I'm going to do business differently there.
All right, and let's get into some specific events that took place in regards to America's foreign policy in Latin America in the decades and centuries pre-Obama, because there, of course, were so many. And it looks like in your article you start with the Spanish-American War and involvement in Cuba during the McKinley administration and take it all the way up through the administration of George W. Bush and the attempted removal of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So can you go over some of the main events and some of the highlights or lowlights, I guess, in the time period leading up to Obama?
Yeah, the lowlights. You can draw almost a continuous line from early American history to the present, but for convenience sake, the article broke it into sort of two stages: the pre-modern era and the modern era. It starts as early as the idea of American expansion. It's at the beginning of American expansion. I mean, American expansion is a movement west, with indigenous people, but the idea of foreign intervention begins incredibly early. Probably the first guided in America was, as you said, McKinley, in this incredible act of betrayal where McKinley promises the Cubans that America will come in, fight off the Spanish, liberate Cuba, give Cuban independence. But then as soon as they fight off the Spanish, the privileges of the conqueror, they then say we're going to stay and govern. So they promise Cuba to get rid of Spain, to liberate Cuba, but then they get rid of Spain and steal Cuba. It did the exact same thing in the Philippines, by the way, but I was focusing just on Latin America. So you get McKinley sort of starting it off in Latin America. Then 1903, you get Theodore Roosevelt, and you get kind of McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft are kind of the big three at getting this started in American history. Roosevelt in 1903 plays this amazing trick where he wants what would be the Panama Canal. At the time, there was no Panama. It was Colombia, and Colombia didn't want to give up the Panama Canal. So what Roosevelt does is he simply sells Panama to Colombia. The president in a country installs a government whose very first act is to sign over the canal. So you get the stealing of the creation of Panama in order to steal the canal from Colombia. Canals, by the way, are sort of another type of natural resource, as you see in the history of Panama, Suez, this idea of being able to use your land in some way to make money. America wants to use the Panama. In 1908, this is a really little talked about one. You almost never hear about this. In 1908, you get the states cooperating in the removal of Gomez in Venezuela. And Adam, that's kind of an amazing one, because if you read the story of Vicente Gomez, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If you read his and you just take the name Gomez and plug in the name Chavez, you would swear you were reading something that's actually in the modern era. Right? It's like the exact same story, 1908, 2000, so then 1909, you get President Taft taking out a leader in Nicaragua because he's trying to force American companies to honor their agreements, so Nicaragua gets their share of the wealth. So those are the sort of really early ones going through Cuba, Panama, Venezuela, Nicaragua. If you come into the modern era now, the modern era sort of begins the first kind of real CIA coup in Latin America. You had the one in Iran, and then almost contemporary with Iran, you get Eisenhower's CIA taking Arbenz out in Guatemala over this sort of, again, this natural resource war. So 54 is the first modern era sort of CIA coup. Eisenhower would do Guatemala. The other thing he would do, and Kennedy always gets sort of tagged with this, but it was Eisenhower who started the covert action to get rid of Castro. Kennedy would continue that, trying unsuccessfully to have the coup in Cuba. Kennedy would also do the very little discussed Brazilian coup in 1964 that took out sort of moderately socialist Goulart government. It's interesting because the last time Brazil had a moderately socialist government, the CIA took them out. And then, of course, now with Dilma Rousseff, we've got a moderately socialist government in Brazil again, and that's sort of the most recent one. So you get this continuation of this theme in Brazil. Kennedy also started the very little discussed removal of power of this really cool guy named Chetty Jagan again. It gets way too little written about him, but the Americans cooperated in his removal. 1971, well known, Nixon takes out Salvador Allende in Chile. A little bit more controversial is Omar Torrijos, the plane crash. Torrijos was the Panamanian leader whose plane crashed. Wide speculation at the time in Latin America, and it was a CIA coup. Never proven. Still, a lot of people think it was. There's definitely, I shouldn't say definitely, there seems to be fairly clear evidence that Torrijos' assassination had been on the table. There's documentation prior to this that it's at least something they were thinking of doing. Jamie Rolls would die in the same way at the same time, so in Ecuador. So there's this pattern there. And then you get the George H.W. Bush removal of Noriega. You get Haiti's Jean-Bertrand Aristide being taken out twice, right up to the 2002 short-lived coup of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela under George W. Bush. So you can almost name your president, and you get this sort of steady line of Latin American coups right up to the present.
No, it's really amazing just how far.
That was long. I said a lot there.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how far back this history goes and how consistent this policy has been across American administrations. But, of course, candidate Obama and President Obama during the earliest portions of his presidency promised to be different in regards to Latin America and set goals that would be different from his predecessors. So what did candidate Obama and then President Obama at the very beginning of his presidency say he would do in regards to Latin America and say that he would do differently than his predecessors?
So candidate Obama and even newly elected Obama said that he would reverse his course, that he would deal with Latin America more respectfully, that there'd be, better relations, and presumably that meant sort of less coups. When I looked at the period of Obama's 8 years in office, though, the pattern that I found suggested that the only thing Obama did differently is that he changed the nature of the coups, that the coups didn't stop. The only way he treated Latin American differently is that the coups became more what I've called silent coups. He stopped using military coups. He stopped using CIA coups or overtly CIA coups, and began using what I've called the silent coup, which is this idea. Silent coups usually appeared in Latin America either as a coup disguised as a democracy, so a coup that was disguised as a legislative or judicial move to get rid of a president but was illegitimate and really a coup, or else as what appeared to be mass protests on the street, where the mass protest wasn't a converted minority into a dissatisfied majority, but it was really just the same minority that lost in the polls, spilling out onto the streets, and a minority who's unable to make change in the polls make a lot more noise protesting on the streets. And what you get is these minorities who are louder in the streets than majorities are in a silent polling booth. So you got these things that looked like, in both cases under Obama, coups looked like democracy in action, either mass movements on the street. But, if you get a country of 70 million people where you've got a minority of say 30 million people who lost the election, and even a small fraction of those, you get 2 million people out in the street, which looks like a massive, massive protest. It's really just a very small percentage of the minority percentage that lost the Democratic vote in the first place. So I don't think Obama changed anything in terms of doing coups. I think he did much subtler coups, and I would draw an analogy that the way Obama shifted sort of tank and gun wars into much more silent drone wars, he also shifted coups from much more noisy tank and gun coups to much more silent, or what I've called silent coups.
All right, now I want to get into some specific countries and what the Obama administration's policies were towards those countries, and the coups or attempted coups there, and any U.S. involvement there. So let's start out with Honduras. There was a coup in 2009. The Honduras coup has been brought up a little bit more recently, maybe not enough, but a little bit because of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's role. But what happened in Honduras, and what was the U.S. involvement there?
So this is the first one. This is very early in Obama's administration. This is June 2009. And you're right. Hillary Clinton played, and we'll get to it, she played a large role. And so this came up during the the elections when Trump was talking about less coups, and here was Clinton who had been involved in this coup. So what we get in Honduras is a democratically elected president. His name is Manuel Zelaya. He's actually the second Zelaya to be taken out in a coup, because he was one of those early beginning of the 20th century guys taken out named Zelaya too. So Zelaya gets seized at gunpoint. He's in his pajamas. It's the morning. They break into his house. They kidnap him at gunpoint. They whisk him off in what essentially is a rendition in a plane that stops at a U.S. military base to refuel. So you get this thing that clearly seems to be a coup. The Americans know. Within a month of the coup, there's cables being sent from the U.S. Embassy in Honduras to Washington. One of the cables had the, if it wasn't real, hilarious title. Clearly, they never meant anyone to see it. It was called Open and Shut, the cable Honduran coup. Like, no question of the coup. And the embassy paper says there's no doubt that the military, the Supreme Court, the Congress conspired in an illegal coup. So the Americans know very soon this is a coup. They knew prior to it that it was a coup also because they had been in constant contact with the Honduran military. Mark Weisbrot, I love Mark Weisbrot. He's a great scholar in Latin America. He told me in an interview that the Obama administration had been talking to the Honduran military right up to the day of the coup. They claimed to convince them not to do it. Weisbrot said that's ridiculous. They have amazing, the Honduran military is pretty much depend on U.S. They could have talked them out if they wanted to. And the Minister of Culture in the Zelaya government, Rodolfo Pastor Fasquelle, I hope I'm saying his name right, Fasquelle, he said the same thing. He said that CIA operatives and U.S. military were in direct contact with the conspirators right up to the second of the coup. In fact, he says they helped in the coup. So despite this American knowledge that it's a coup, they never recalled their ambassador. They didn't decrease military funding, which you have to do if it's a coup. In fact, they increased military funding. When all the Latin American organizations are refusing to recognize the new government or are calling for Zelaya's return, the U.S. is recognizing the new government, not calling for his return. In fact, that was the thing that Clinton said in her book. She talks about in the days immediately following the coup that she was trying to really quickly organize an election to, as she says, render the question of Zelaya moot. So Clinton's not only not, though she knows it's a coup. She's not only backing the coup government, she's trying to keep Zelaya out. And then as soon as the new government's elected, the Americans recognize the new government. Virtually no one else recognizes the new government. So they're at least complicit in the coup, in recognizing it and allowing it. Zelaya says it was worse than that. He said the Americans were involved in the coup. Zelaya said from the beginning that the coup came from the U.S. There's no doubt that there's this shady question of why the rendition plane would stop in the U.S. military base in Palmarola for 15 to 20 minutes to refuel when they're going to Costa Rica, which is really, really close. So there's this long, seemingly unnecessary stopover at a U.S. military base in the heat of a coup. So this one's at least clear assistance and cover by silence and preventing the new guy from coming, the elected president from coming in. At worst, there's participation. So this is a really typical historical handling of Honduras. So test one, Obama seems to change nothing.
All right. Now, the next three, I guess, that I want to get to are perhaps largely unknown to most listeners in the U.S. So this will be brand new probably to most people. And the first one I want to look at is Ecuador. So what happened there?
So Ecuador is intriguing because you get this elected president, Rafael Correa. He's, part of the sort of left-wing move in Latin America. He's enormously effective, enormously popular. And the interesting thing about Correa is that he anticipates this coup. As soon as Zelaya is taken out of Honduras, Correa says that we've got intelligence reports to say I'm next. And sure enough, very early after saying we're next, there's an attempt on Korea. Korea. I might be saying his name wrong. I don't mean the country of Korea. I mean Correa, Rafael Correa. This is clearly an attempted coup. It fails, but it's clearly an attempted coup. Correa had all those sort of markings going back to the very beginning of the type of guy that's a victim of these coups. He's renegotiated oil contracts to get a bigger share of the money for Ecuador. So there's that typical nationalizing thing again that you see in all these guys that get removed from office. He has closed down the U.S. military base in Ecuador. He's not in favor of trade agreements with America. Perhaps most poignantly, he's joined ALBA, the organization that includes Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia. So this is one of those in Latin America that's in that sort of loosely knit group of people with Hugo Chavez and Lula da Silva in Brazil, who are trying to say we don't need to turn to America and take their terms. We can turn inwardly and help each other. So we've got all those markings. We know that the Americans had talked prior to Obama. It was on the table to not allow Correa to come to power and to take him out if he did. So we've got these embassy cables, WikiLeaks released them, of the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador saying that we can't allow Correa to get elected because her word is derail. It'll derail the U.S. plan for Latin America. And then we've got these other cables coming from the ambassador, Linda Jewell, saying that we're discouraging potential allies from working with Correa. And in one cable, she even admits to working with Ecuadorians and other groups who share their vision that Correa would derail their plan. So there's these cables openly saying that they're working against Correa. This was pre-Obama. But there's these cables openly saying that the Americans want to work against Correa. Correa comes in. He does these sort of democratic nationalist policies that Americans don't like. There's continued interference in Ecuadorian affairs under the Obama administration. The coup leader, as so often in Latin America, was one of those graduates of the School of the Americas. In Ecuador, they appoint a commission to look into the attempted coup. The commission officially concludes that what they called foreign actors had been involved in the coup that had come from outside of Ecuador. That's as far as they went and what they said. They just called it foreign actors. One member of the commission, though, did come out later and say that it was his belief that the State Department and CIA had been involved. So Ecuador is another early Obama years, one for this guy that looks like a potential target. Embassy cables identify him clearly as a target. Then there's an attempt to take him out, and there's certainly at least some evidence saying that the U.S. was involved in the takeout when you look at the commission and who pulled off the coup and the embassy cables. So that's the kind of shady and intriguing story of Ecuador. What was the next one you want to talk about after Ecuador?
Yeah. So the next two I want to get to are Haiti and Paraguay. Okay.
So Haiti has a long history, right? Haiti has a really long history of American and Canadian and others intervening. So the immediate history of the United States Consulate Jean-Bertrand Aristide been taken out twice already by Americans. So twice you get this really popular social innovator in Haiti. And so he's been taken out twice. And Aristide is the leader of a party that has won every single election that party has ever competed in Haiti. So this is an enormously popular leader, an enormously popular party. It's a party the party's called Famille Lavalas, and every time it runs, it wins. It's the biggest, most popular party in Haiti. So now we've got an election coming up in Haiti. And we've got America bankrolling the election. So the States is paying about $14 million to finance this Haitian election. That's an amount. $14 million is an amount, since you're running, that you would think would give America some say. But what happens in this American-run election is that the ruling party appoints an electoral council. Okay, so first of all, the Constitution doesn't let the ruling party appoint the electoral council, because the electoral council is neutral. But the ruling party appoints an electoral council. The electoral council, funded by the Americans, bans Famille Lavalas. They ban the party of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. So they win every time they compete. But in this American-funded election, they're not allowed to compete. So immediately you've got, it's a coup, right? But then what happens is the coup continues, the influence continues when we go to a second round runoff in the election. In the second round runoff, you get two really unpopular candidates. We're both essentially on the same side, and the runoff's not even legal because the Provisional Electoral Council never got the number of votes to ratify the first round. So the guy who gets elected in Haiti gets elected because the guy that the Haitians wanted to elect isn't allowed to run. And then in a runoff, you get two people from basically the same party, and it's not even a legal runoff in the first place. So this is a coup in Haiti because the guy who's allowed to run, the guy who they wanted to win, isn't even allowed to run. So that's like a preemptive coup. You know, you're not even taking the guy out. You're intervening so early that you're illegally making sure he can't even win. Paraguay happens in 2012, and Paraguay doesn't get talked about. You know, Haiti makes the news sometimes. Paraguay just doesn't make the news. What you've got in Paraguay is this democratically elected, moderately left-wing leader named Fernando Lugo. And there's this skirmish over land in Paraguay that leaves, I think it was 11 people dead. And the opposition seizes on this and somehow, not clear how, somehow blames the deaths of 11 people on President Lugo and then impeaches him. And the impeachment is, he has no way of defeating the impeachment. He's given, I think 2 days to prepare a defense and 2 hours to deliver the defense. All the Latin American organizations, Mercosur, UNISOR, all of them suspend the Paraguayan government. They throw them out because it's a coup government. The United States never called it a coup. In fact, the day the coup went down, the Americans were negotiating a military base in Paraguay, you know, with the coup government. Once again, though, we know that the states knew this was a coup, or at least should have known that it was clearly potentially a coup, because what we've got is, again, embassy cables. These go back 3 years prior to the coup. So the coup's 2012. We have 2009 cables saying that the right-wing opposition is going to impeach Lugo and ensure that they rule based on any Lugo misstep. And they even say that they'll impeach Lugo on whatever they call it, whatever spurious grounds they can find. So this is another one of those ones that I called earlier that was sort of a coup disguised as democracy, because it looks like this is happening in the legislature, that he's being challenged, he's being impeached. But as the cables clearly tell us, they're seizing on any spurious thing they can to illegally impeach him. So this is another impeachment of another left-wing leader at a time when Latin America was, you know, swinging to the left, and then under Obama, you see this pendulum swinging back to the right as you lose left-wing presidents in Honduras and Ecuador and Haiti and Paraguay, and this is all in that first term when Obama's in office.
Friends, if you want to gain a deeper understanding of history, economics, political theory, the sorts of topics we cover on this show, then check out Liberty Classroom, featuring a wide variety of courses, including some that are taught by professors who have been guests on this show, such as Kevin Gutzman, Jason Jewell, and GP Manish. Liberty Classroom will provide you with videos, audio files, question and answer sessions, discussion forums, and all of the resources you need to become a better debater and have a deeper knowledge of American history, world history, economics, political theory, and more. Learn real history and economics right at your computer or on the go, and be able to more confidently and clearly articulate your views. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn the information necessary to become a master debater for a mere 24 cents a day. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to find out more about Liberty Classroom and to help support the Wake Up Call podcast. All right, and now for two that are fairly recent and that have gotten some mainstream media attention in the U.S., and those are the attempted coups or successful coup in the latter case in Venezuela and in Brazil. So what happened in those two countries, and what involvement did the United States have in those?
Venezuela is the key, because the Americans saw Hugo Chavez as the sort of magnet that was drawing the other countries, or as the ringleader, or in those words that from the Kennedy administration that Chomsky's used so often, is this idea of the contagion. Chavez was the contagion. Chavez had this model of defiance. It wasn't even meant to be defiance. It's an alternative model. And American foreign policy doesn't allow alternative models because then countries can be drawn to the alternative and away from America. And then in Latin America, you lose your backyard. So Chavez was the key. In 2002, I won't say too much about this one because clearly that's pre-Obama. You can't put that one on Obama. But in 2002, there's a successful but very short-lived coup because Chavez is so popular, the people overturn the coup and get him put back into place. There's a whole history of this one. American involvement in that coup is clear and confessed, and there's no question, but that one has to be pinned on Bush and not on Obama. But what we do get for Obama is two more events in Venezuela. The first is the 2013 election, where the Venezuelan right and the United States really hoped that the Bolivarian Revolution was over, that Chavez had won the successive string of elections, referendums, but that with his far less charismatic successor, Nicolas Maduro, would not be able to win and it would be over. But what happened is Maduro won. It was terrifyingly close for his party because they thought he'd win by more, but he won. And so what happens when he wins is that it's a totally fair election. There's electoral monitors there from all over the world. There's like 150 electoral monitors, including ones that the United States respects or center. So you've got really good electoral monitors there. The election's declared fair, transparent. 54% of polling computers in Venezuela are automatically recounted. This is a fair election. The entire world recognizes a fair election. The entire world recognizes the Maduro government as legitimate government in the United States. The United States of America is the only country in the world that refuses to recognize the election results. So the single only country in the world that refuses to recognize it. The opposition says they want a full recount and not a 54% recount. Nicolas Maduro says fine, he agrees, so there'll be a full recount. The opposition by Capriles says he has all these complaints with elections unfair. When Maduro opens up to recount, everything's on the board. Capriles never did file complaints, never once officially filed a single complaint about the election, but the United States still refused to recognize the election. So they gave cover to the Capriles opposition. They didn't recognize the Maduro government. Then 2 years later, in 2015, you get another attempted coup in Venezuela, and Maduro explicitly, this time, he explicitly accuses the Americans of being involved in and being behind the coup. Now, it's clear that America's been just pouring money into the Venezuelan opposition trying to get rid of Chavez and Maduro. In the years since Chavez came to power, over $90 million have poured into Venezuela, and it's this U.S.-funded opposition that in 2015 tried to pull off again. And Maduro says the Americans are behind him. And he doesn't make this accusation with no evidence at all. There is a volume of evidence that Venezuela produces that it was a coup and that the States was involved. They've got a recording of the communique that they were going to issue after the fall of the Maduro government. They've got confessions by military officials. They have a recorded phone call between the coup leaders. The coup leaders signed a national transition agreement. At least one of them was known to be in contact by phone with the States that day. A number of the coup leaders had pre-obtained U.S. visas to prepare to escape if the coup failed. So again, you get this constant interference in Venezuela. You get what looks like American involvement in Venezuela. And then the other one you mentioned, Adam, is Brazil. This has gotten some coverage. It hasn't gotten a lot of coverage. You'd think it would have more coverage given the size of Brazil. I mean, Brazil is an economic powerhouse. It's the leading, economic engine of South America. But, and again, in 1964, there was a coup in Brazil. There was a Kennedy started. It happened just after Kennedy's assassination, but there was a Kennedy-initiated coup. There's a history of coups in Brazil when you get moderately socialist governments. And what you've got in Brazil right now is this disaster for the right wing. You've got this disaster where you've got Lula da Silva, twice elected. Each time he's elected, I can't remember the exact numbers, mid-60s, like 60% of the vote. Very popular government. Constitutional rule in Brazil says that after 2 terms, a president has to step down before he can run again. It's not like the States, you can never run again, but you can't have 3 consecutive terms. De Silva was incredibly popular. He leaves office with like an 80% popularity rating. His successor Dilma Rousseff comes up. She wins. The right cannot win an election at the polls, and now they're facing this horrific future where Lula da Silva, with 80% popularity, can come back and run again. They're never going to win at the polls, and so Dilma Rousseff, they call her Dilma in Brazil. They're never going to win at the polls, so Dilma gets removed another way. And why do I say it's a coup when, again, it looks constitutional? It looks like another one of these legislative coups. We know it's a coup because they admitted it's a coup both before and after. So you got this prior and posterior brazen admissions of coups. Prior to the coup, we have a transcript that got published where the coup plotters are openly discussing it as a coup. They call it a national pact to remove Dilma. It clearly says that the generals, the courts, the Congress, that everybody's on board. So they're talking about this coup. They talk about securing the involvement of the justices. It's a clear admission over and over again that it's a coup. Then Dilma gets taken out on. Now keep in mind that in all of these investigations into corruption in Brazil, Dilma is one of the only officials that has had nothing pinned on her for corruption. The event the fiscal event that they allegedly took her out for. There's 2 problems with the claim that they took her out for that alleged fiscal event. The one is that prior to her removal, the Supreme Court of Brazil clearly declared that she had not broken the law. So she got impeached for breaking a law that the Supreme Court said she didn't break. The other thing is the very first thing the coup government did when they came into office was to legalize the very budgetary act they claimed to impeach Rousseff for. So Rousseff has done nothing wrong. Dilma's done nothing wrong. We've got a tape before talking openly about the coup and the removal. And then after the coup, you get Michel Temer, the new coup leader, who, by the way, himself has charges against him and could end up in jail soon. So Michel Temer comes to the United States, and he's giving a talk to economic and foreign policy leaders in the States. And he says straight up, like he's so confident that America supports the coup, or is at least going to be silent about the coup, that he says straight up that what happened was that he pressured the Dilma Rousseff government to adopt a right-wing economic policy that was completely inconsistent with the one that she had been elected on, and that when she refused to do it, they threw overboard. He says, and I'm quoting now, but as that did not work out, the plan wasn't adopted, and a process was established which culminated with me being installed as President of the Republic. So he straight up says to Americans, Dylan wouldn't do what we wanted, so we started a process, we took her out, we put me in. So we've got this coup. Again, at the very least, America's silent. Temer can actually come to America and talk about it without worrying about American opposition. So you get American sort of acquiescence and acceptance of the coup. There's also, is there more proof that America's actually involved in the coup? No. Is there some suspicion? Yes. One of them is that many of the major players in the coup are important U.S. government allies. So some of the players in the coup are people that are allied with and are associated with the U.S. government. You've got all kinds of money being pumped into Brazil from CIA-related organizations. The very day after the coup, one of the major coup players came to the United States and met with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and others. So you get the coup. The next day, the coup government comes to the States. The States could have called off the meeting. They said, we don't recognize the coup government. But they don't call off. They meet with them. They accept him. They approve of him. So at the very, very least, we've got American approval for what the Brazilians concede as a coup. That was the last chance that Obama had to keep good on his promise to do business differently in Latin America, and he failed that one too.
Right, but one place where we could say that he did do business differently in Latin America is in Cuba. And for all the shortcomings of, as far as press coverage on Brazil, and it is rather remarkable that the Brazil situation has gotten so little coverage in the U.S. With Brazil's large population and influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Cuba situation, though, has gotten a lot of coverage, and it is very much on the minds of a lot of people, I'm sure, when the subject of Latin America under the Obama administration comes up. So what has Obama's policy towards Cuba been, and how did that differ from the policies of his predecessors?
So Cuba is the one place where Obama's won points in Latin America. That one move has done more good for the view of America and Latin America than everything else. But it was greeted with tremendous cynicism and suspicion because it was immediately followed by America declaring, Venezuela a terrorist threat to the United States, military, not a terrorist threat, a danger to, like a military threat to. The idea that Venezuela is a military threat to America was clearly still Obama doing business in the old way. So they didn't. So Latin America took this as sort of a two-sided message. On the one hand, we're reaching out to Cuba. On the other hand, there's still the same old business in Venezuela and Latin America. It did win in points. It was the most positive thing he did in Latin America. I think the attitude in Latin America, though, is that so far it's mostly words. The embargo hasn't been lifted. So in Latin America, I think the attitude towards Obama on Cuba is maybe a passing grade, but we'll see. So he's said what they're going to do. It's certainly an improvement in relations and opening relations, but the bottom line for Cubans is that they're still under embargo. At the most recent UN vote on whether Cuba should be embargoed, a vote that the Americans have always voted yes on against most of the world, almost comically, America abstained this year. So America abstained on its own embargo on Cuba. So the Cuba, I think here we can say that Obama did better in Cuba by opening relations. That was a big move to open relations with Cuba, but the embargo's still on. So I think we can't give him passing grades on that yet. We can give him a temporary pass, but the embargo's still on. So better, but not wholly a new way of doing business in Latin America.
Okay, so I guess maybe an incomplete grade. We've seen we've seen improvements in relations. We've seen increased travel, but as you said, the embargo is still on. So all right, so let's give Obama an overall grade for Latin American policy. What would that be, and what advice would you have for President-elect Trump in terms of what his Latin American policy should look like?
Well, I think the grade you have to give him is a failing grade. I think we counted. I'd have to count, but I think we counted like about six coups, or six or so, almost a coup a year since he came into office. So I think you have to give Obama a failing grade on coups. I don't know what to expect from Trump. Trump's no one knows what to expect. Trump's domestic policy in a way scares me more than his foreign policy. He says he's going to be less interventionist. I don't know what Trump's going to do. My hope for America in the next 4 years is to respect Latin America, to change this history where every time Latin Americans try to get any kind of wealth or decent living from their own natural resources, America comes in and stops them and takes those resources for themselves. That's been the history of Latin America. Hopefully hopefully the future of American relations with Latin America will be a future in which Latin Americans get to enjoy a decent standard of living because they get to enjoy the wealth of their own natural resources.
All right, yeah, it is hard to get a read on what Donald Trump would do in regards to Latin America. It's hard to get a read on what he would do with a lot of things. But I want to thank you so much for joining me and discussing this history and then looking at the Obama administration and their policies. And this has been a lot of fun, and I hope that this has whetted the appetite of my listeners to take a look at your article and perhaps learn more about these topics. In addition to your article, if someone wants to learn more about U.S. Latin American policy or just about what's happening in specific Latin American countries, what resources or readings would you direct them to? There's tons of really good stuff on this. He's got tons of good stuff. There's lots of books on CIA involvement. John Prados' book, Safe for Democracy, does a really good job on the history of this. In contemporary stuff, I think I said earlier, I'm a big fan of Mark Weisbrod and his works on Latin America. This is well-documented stuff. It doesn't make it into the mainstream media, but this is well-documented stuff.
So lots of books on CIA coups, Chomsky, Wise, Broad, Prados, with three names that come to mind quickly. The stuff's out there. It's not in the mainstream media, but this is documented stuff that's out there.
No, it definitely is. And I mentioned this at the very beginning, but that was a little while ago. So in case anyone has forgotten, what are the best places to follow your work?
Most of the work I do, most of my work is either on antiwar.com or on Robert Perry's site at Consortium News. I publish other places too, but those are the places that I most publish are Anti-War and Consortium News.
Okay, great. Well, I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/Obama-Latin-America. And that's going to be the place to go for this episode. And, of course, we'll link to your antiwar.com archive and your consortiumnews.com archive, as well as the article we've been discussing, which, again, is called The End of Obama's Term, a Report Card on Latin America. And there will also be links to some Mark Weisbrot archives and that Safer Democracy book you mentioned. All of the resources that we've mentioned over the course of this interview. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Obama-Latin-America is the place to go for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher or another podcatcher of your preference. And that way you can keep up to date on what's happening and make sure not to miss any episodes. And also I want to encourage people to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast is the handle for that. And Ted, thank you so much for your time today, for being so generous with your time, and for helping me to go through what's been happening in Latin America in the last handful of years and the role of the Obama administration in the United States in the 8 or so countries that we looked at. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot. It was great talking to you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.